So tonight we're doing Micah, Nahum, and Habakkuk. And even though they're in the minor prophets, it doesn't mean their prophecies weren't very significant. And in fact, Micah's ministry was during the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. So who's he a contemporary with?
Oh, Isaiah.
Isaiah, that's right. Yeah, he's there at the same time as Isaiah. Now that gives us a good feel because his audience then is going to be the Judeans, who are during this time period in Hezekiah's day, who had recently experienced the fall of Samaria. So that's sort of like a wake-up call. We're vulnerable. We could be next. And in fact, in Micah, he has some prophecies against Samaria, which were probably pronounced before its fall, because his ministry did begin before the fall of Samaria, during the time of Jotham. And so they would have been feeling some of the pressure from the Assyrian advances into Judah. And they'd have seen much of Judah ransacked, in fact. Because remember, under Hezekiah, every city in Judah was destroyed except Jerusalem when the Assyrians came in. You know, the villages were stripped and emptied. So they would be the generation who had experienced Hezekiah's reforms, the ones receiving this, but they weren't committed to them. And you see that because as soon as Manasseh becomes king, the nation plunges into moral degradation and spiritual decay. So that's really the setting of what he's writing to. Isaiah's ministry actually began probably a little before his, because Isaiah began the year Uzziah died. There's not an indication here that Micah began at the exact same time, but pretty close to the same time. Because again, Uzziah is followed by Jotham. And so he named Jotham as one of them. So they're pretty much contemporary. And in fact, the end of their ministries are pretty close to the same, because Isaiah ministered until Hezekiah died, and then Manasseh killed him, or had him killed. And it's an interesting thing. Manasseh, you may not remember this, was the longest reigning king in Judah. He reigned for 55 years. He was also one of the most wicked, if not the most wicked. But he also repented. And he is one of them who's mentioned in some of the Assyrian captives lists. He had joined an alliance against Assyria, just like Isaiah had warned him not to. And lost, would be the nice way to say it, and got taken as a prisoner to Babylon. And while there repented, and God let him come back, which was very unusual. So that's where the nation's headed to at the time that Micah is writing. Now, in Micah, the imagery Micah chooses to use is what we would call the courtroom or lawsuit motif. God takes Judah to court. That's really what he's doing here. So you have this courtroom motif. That's his object lesson. And the issue in Micah, which we've seen before, is social injustices. And this is what's bringing judgment upon the nation. Even while Hezekiah was reigning, social injustice continued. You had the powerful people who were taking advantage of people through the court system and things like that. And so the dominant theme here in Micah is the coming judgment on Judah for social injustices. So he's really anticipating the Babylonian captivity. If we could place this thing chronologically, he might even be anticipating the Assyrian attack. You know, some of his messages would have. But ultimately, this book is anticipating the Babylonian captivity, which will come some years later. Now, his message and again, I've given you this before, is that God's judgment on Judah results from her social injustices and is reason for the righteous to continue to trust and obey him. So again, typical of all the prophets, the bottom line for Micah is he's really writing for the benefit of the righteous who are living in the land as it's decaying, to encourage them to stick it out and be faithful to the end, and to teach their kids to be faithful, because there is a time when there's going to be blessing and there's going to be a return. But to see that what's happening to them is not God deserting them, but God disciplining them. You know, one of the challenges I think that we're going to face is, depending on what the political climate is and all, you know, God's factors that he brings in, our nation could face a period of judgment. And one of the things that even now when I talk to college students, I'm talking to them about anticipating the fact that the world's not going to stay the way it is. America's not going to stay the way it is. And historically, in fact, if you follow the pattern of history, we're at the same place that Babylon was, Assyria was, Rome was, about 40 or 50 years before they weren't anymore. You know, we are at the zenith of our power, and the barbarians are after us, and we're not capable of defending ourselves because of corruption from within. And so we could see our nation gone in another 50 years. And so we need to be prepared to continue to trust God and live for him whatever happens. I mean, what are we going to do if this becomes an Islamic nation? What are we going to do if they successfully destroy us and we collapse and become an afterthought of the nation? How are we going to handle that? If our economy gets devastated, what will we do? Those are the kind of things. And what we have to do is continue to live for the Lord. That's the key. Now, a broad outline. I would outline Micah this way. First 2 chapters, judgment is coming. And it's basically the thrust of the first 2 chapters. Judgment is coming. And in chapters 3 through 5, now here's where he sort of changes the patterns. Where they usually end this way, in the middle, he talks about future blessing. So chapters 3 through 5, he's looking at their future blessing, the fact that God is going to restore them. And then chapter 6 and 7 ends talking about both their sin and restoration. It's like a mix of the first parts. Now, his first message, chapter 1 2 again, is that judgment is coming on the nation because of her sins. And so in chapter 1, again, we have this courtroom motif, and we're told here that the cities of Judah face defeat and exile because of God's judgment on the nation's sins. And it's all the cities except Jerusalem. So this tells us this message came when? Prior to Sennacherib's invasion. Because it's fulfilled in Sennacherib's invasion.
He is unsuccessful. He wasn't successful.
Well, he took every city but Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So he fulfilled God's purposes, but God did not intend for him to take Jerusalem. And God defended Jerusalem from him.
As a sign to history.
Yeah.
That God could step in.
And it's interesting because Sennacherib, when he reported this invasion, it was all in, of course, glowing terms. Lachish, the conquest of Lachish, he was so impressed with, he made a mural on his wall of his palace to celebrate it. And when in his annals, when he recorded the fact that he attacked them, he mentions Hezekiah. And he talks about how he caged him in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. Of course, he failed to mention the fact that the next night he lost 185,000 men, and had to go back home. But he reported in the most glowing figures, and it is true though. By the time he was done, the only thing left in Judah was whoever was inside the walls of Jerusalem, because they wiped out every city, every town and village, and basically hauled everything off. It was devastating. And it would take Judah, of course, years to recover from that, just in time to be taken over by the Babylonians. And you can see this is a fulfillment, really, of what God had said in Deuteronomy that He was going to do. And I find it really ironic that when Israel entered into the Promised Land, they had 600 and some odd thousand fighting men, probably 2.5 million people. By the time the northern tribes, the last deportation, there's only about 10,000 left. Out of 10 tribes. And when Judah's hauled off, when you start counting the heads of all the people that got carried into Babylonian captivity, it's only about 50,000. I mean, everyone else is dead. They were wiped out over time by plagues and famine and disease as well as warfare. And they're scattered all over the place.
Let me say, it's kind of confusing scripture-wide. We get various reasons for that. I mean, you pinpointed social injustice, but behind social injustice, they talk about the sin of pride.
Yeah.
Is there something behind, I guess rejection of God over pride, or pride over God? There's more than social injustice there. There's something causing them to act the way.
Well, the cause for the social injustice would be the pride, and I believe pride may be the greatest sin because it's Satan's sin. And a lot of other sins grow out of pride, especially injustice, especially abusing people.
So that'd be the bottom line.
Yeah,
really.
That would be the bottom line. Ultimately, it is pride.
And that's pretty much consistent from one end to the other.
Yeah.
What the scripture says.
Yeah.
Now, there's kind of a Christian social justice movement.
Yes.
Among churches and different things, and so when you speak of social justice, though, you're speaking more as a byproduct of individual decisions and group decisions as it relates to sin, not as it relates to government and the way it operates and laws.
No, actually, in this case, it related to the government and the way it operated as well.
Okay.
Because what you had happening in Israel or Judah at this time is the wealthy would drag the poor into court and take their stuff from them, and the judges would help the wealthy do it. Or they would just have the guy bumped off and then swoop in and take possession of his property. And so there were a lot of people just simply being murdered.
That was pretty prevalent with Ahab and Jezebel.
Yeah, that's right. Ahab and Jezebel did it, and in fact, that was, Jerusalem was described as basically being spattered with the blood of innocent people, of the righteous.
I think several places in the prophets they talk about the judges being bribed and the prophets being paid for prophecy and priests ministering for money and stuff like that. So there's
crooked businessmen. You went all the way down. And so, if you were a widow or an orphan, you had no one to help you. You were defenseless. And your property could be taken from you. You could be enslaved. And it was government supported. So it would be, when we talk about it, it would be looking at our federal laws and things like that, and our court system. It's not talking so much about individual. That does play down to that level, but it was more systematic, and it was national. So in some ways it relates to the social justice movement in churches, although those are, I think, more not thinking nationally. Because I have to say this, our nation is messed up, but we have more justice in this country than anywhere else. Compared to the rest of the world, and I know that's not always that good, there's greater justice here than there is anywhere else, which is one of the reasons I think why God has blessed us at this time. Although sin is growing and that justice is eroding, because we do see the courts now beginning to support unrighteousness and beginning to punish the righteous and those kinds of things. So you do see it changing. And if it does, we'll be judged. If it does, we're doomed. Now, this first chapter begins with, as I've listed in your notes, an indictment and a sentence. God witnesses against the people. And again, here's this courtroom motif. And he promises to judge both Judah and Israel for their sins. And Samaria is going to be completely destroyed. Again, this is before the fall of Samaria. This is early on in his ministry. It's followed by the lament, again, mourning the destruction, and that makes it clear as to who's going to be defeated and all those kind of things. But defeat and exile. Remember in Deuteronomy, that's the last phase. See, what Micah's message is that we're now in the final phase of God's judgment. We've gone past famines and pestilence and drought and defeat. Now we're going to captivity. And again, the issue is injustice. Chapter 2, he talks about their injustices. And he pronounces a woe against them. And again, what's a woe mean?
Too late.
Yeah, it's too late. You're doomed. There is absolutely no hope. So woe to those who devise iniquity and work out evil on their beds. So you've got a society now where they're lying awake at night, figuring out what to do next. In the morning light they practice it because it is the power of their hand. They covet fields and take them by violence. Houses and seize them. They oppress a man in his house, a man in his inheritance. And so you have this corrupt society. And basically what you have then, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer because the rich are just ripping them off. And these are some things we see it in other parts of the world right now. We do see these kinds of things happening.
I look at India and the caste system thing over there, and
South America, and you've got the ultimate, the ultra rich with their little armies, and everybody else is out of luck. And places like I think it's Nigeria right now. They're experiencing like 30% inflation or something, some horrendous inflation rate. Well, people are just devastated, except that top tier who's getting richer while all this is going on. And so, the top 2% of the nations just getting fabulously rich off of this while everybody else is being destroyed in poverty. Well, that's injustice. And that's what was going on there, and that's what God condemned them for. And he promises, though, it's interesting, he ends chapter 2 with a promise. I will surely assemble all of you, O Jacob. I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. I will put them together like sheep of the fold, like a flock in the midst of their pasture. They will make a loud noise because of so many people. The one who breaks open will come up before them. They will break out, pass through the gate, and go out by it. Their king will pass before them with the Lord at their head. So there's, even in this initial indictment section, he ends with a promise of restoration. That even though they're going to be judged, even though they're going to be destroyed, there's a promise return. And notice though, it's with the Lord at their head. It's really looking, the king, their Lord, is looking at Messiah. The real promise of restoration is with the coming of Messiah. So just like Isaiah talks about the future coming righteous king, the branch, it's the servant of the Lord, here Micah has the same message and uses similar imagery. Now his second message, chapters 3 through 5, is about future blessing. And he begins, Hear now, O heads of Jacob, and you rulers of the house of Israel. Is it not for you to know justice? You who hate good and love evil, who strip the skin from my people and the flesh from their bones, and also eat the flesh of my people, fillet their skin from them, break their bones and chop them in pieces like meat for the pot, like flesh in the cauldron. Then they will cry to the Lord, but he will not hear them. He'll even hide his face from them at the time, because they have been evil in their deeds. And he condemns the prophets. He condemns the rulers. But then he says, beginning in chapter 4, now it will come to pass in the latter days, again, looking at the return of Messiah, that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains and shall be exalted above the hills, and people shall flow to it. Many nations shall come and say, Come, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion the law shall go forth, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between many peoples, and rebuke strong nations afar off. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Where have we heard this description before?
That's Isaiah.
Isaiah.
Isaiah, yes. Isaiah uses that imagery. Both Isaiah and Ezekiel. Remember, in the last chapter of Ezekiel, with the building of the temple and all the nations going up to Jerusalem to worship the Lord. And Isaiah talks about changing the swords into plowshares and these kinds of things. Yes.
And part of that's on a plaque in the United Nations.
No.
Just part of it. They don't
Yeah.
get the whole thing.
Oh, no. Yeah. In fact, there's the ultimate organization that brings social justice. Like food programs. And,
You mean food for guns or whatever?
yeah. That's right. Huh?
You mean money for guns program? Or
That's
whatever?
right. Yeah, the Money for Guns program. Yeah. And so just
Was that on tape? Gosh, Dr. House, you shouldn't say things like that.
yeah. That's right. So anyhow, so he begins with an indictment of the leaders and the false prophets, but the focal point here, beginning in chapter 4, is there is going to be a restoration, but it's going to be under Messiah. It's going to be under a righteous king. And but Judah's still going to go into exile. Here in chapter 4, he says Judah is going into exile. There is that destiny. By this time, there was no turning back. Judah is going into exile, but is also going to be restored. So there's the message of hope. And then chapter 5 looks at the Assyrian threat once again. It says, gather yourself in troops, O daughter of troops. He's laid siege against us. They will strike at the judge of Israel with a rod on the cheek. But you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, this is the one where they found where Jesus comes from. Though you're little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from of old, from everlasting. Therefore he shall give them up until the time that she who is in labor has given birth. Then the remnant of his brethren shall return to the children of Israel, and he shall stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they shall abide, for now he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and this one shall be peace. So, the Messianic promise, we always just hear the very first part of it. But it's very clear that out of Bethlehem is going to come the Messiah who's going to bring this. And in fact, the Jews understand this. World peace. He's going to bring peace. One of their complaints about Jesus not being the Messiah is the fact that he didn't bring peace. And that's one of the reasons why they reject him. But this future ruler is coming, and that's where their hope is. And remember, this is said in the context of, Ahaz was wicked, but you've got Hezekiah, and Hezekiah was not the fulfillment of it. Because it's Hezekiah whose sin led to the Babylonian captivity. And so there is another, there is this future hope. Now, again, I find it very instructive that the context of this message is a people who are unrepentant. Hezekiah is, but what you see from what Micah is telling us here is even though Hezekiah tried to bring reforms, it didn't penetrate the people. His passion for the Lord was not really in the hearts of the people. They went along with him because he's the king. What the king wants, the king gets. And so as long as he was there, yes, they bowed. And they restored the temple, and they went to the ceremonies, and they did all the things because the king said to do it. And that's part of patriotism, is you obey the king, and whatever the king wants to do, we'll do. But it's not it's not anything more than skin deep. And so Micah is telling them that, but it's in that context where this injustice is occurring behind the scenes. And Hezekiah is really not able to stem the tide, is what it boils down to. God still promises restoration, knowing that the nation is in rebellion and going to get worse. I consider that very significant, in that some theologians say that because of Israel's failure, because of rejection of Christ, then God changed his plans. But you know, every time God talks about this coming Messiah and this restoration and this national blessing, it's always in the context of they're at the height of their rebellion. And so God is not surprised by that.
And this whole thing's for the believing remnant, isn't it? I mean, there probably weren't anybody, a handful that went into exile or believed. I mean, it wasn't any, you expect there to be a movement,
Yeah.
you know, like a revival or something,
Yeah.
you know, and nothing. Is that true? I mean, as far as you know, there wasn't even
I think
a whistle of hope.
actually, you know, when Babylon fell to when Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians under Jeremiah, that there were some who heard his message and surrendered and got carried off. Many of the people who went to Babylon were the righteous, the believers.
But did they go that way, or did they get that way and realize in Babylon?
I think there was two groups. There were those that went that way, and then there were those that when they got there, they said, you know, God's words have come true. We'd better do something to preserve. And of course, in Babylon, they began the synagogue system. You know, you didn't have synagogues before Babylon. And they did it in order to maintain the faith. So you had these believers who landed there who said, you know, temple's destroyed, but we still got to be faithful to the Lord. How are we going to do this? Let's get together every Sabbath and let's encourage one another. And so you had this system developed so that they could get together to pray, to sing hymns, worship God in that, you know, in that way, to have teaching of the Scriptures, and to have the social connection, and to maintain their culture, and to maintain their devotion to God. So, you know, I think, and in fact, we're going to see in one of these others that the way God described this judgment is by its design. The Babylonian captivity is the survivors who went to Babylon were the righteous. In other words, by being righteous, God would spare your life.
Wouldn't it kind of stand to reason, too, that only those that surrendered would have been given privilege to actually dwell within the realm of the Babylonian city and have property and...
It would seem that, although I think if you were, you know, like when the city fell, they still took the common people prisoner and hauled them off to Babylon and relocated them in different towns and cities. It was only the leaders that they executed. So as long as you were just a grunt, you still had a chance. But by the time they took the city, most of the people had died of famine, you know, or disease. So again, it may have been that only the righteous were being spared by God, so they could be hauled off. But yeah, you know, it's very likely that they didn't get the better locations. Now, you know, one of the speculations is that, especially in the final captivity, some people think that the reason Daniel wasn't at the statue with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is because he may have been actually in Jerusalem supervising the carting off of the last of the prisoners. And that he may have been in some way involved in that. And very clearly, he would have been involved in locating them in towns and villages and cities. Because he was in charge of the province of Babylon, where they were brought to as prisoners. And so very likely, God used Daniel to take care of them so that they did get in appropriate places and they were allowed to buy property and they were allowed to settle down and start businesses and things like that. And there's probably a lot of Daniel's influence that went into that.
Somebody had to take care of these scrolls.
Yeah.
And preserve them, and
Yeah.
so that we could have them.
Yeah.
I mean, they have them, but they don't believe them.
That's right. And it couldn't be preserved in Jerusalem because it got burned down.
Yeah.
It had to be carried with the priests. And I find it fascinating that they didn't like these prophets, but they still kept their prophecies. Because they recognized it was the Word of God.
Old habits die hard.
Yeah, that's right. So, anyhow, his third message, chapter 6 and 7, is an indictment on the nation once again. but also a promise of restoration. And so he begins chapter 6 with another indictment. Hear now what the Lord says. Arise, plead your case before the mountains, and let the hills hear your voice. Hear, O you mountains, the Lord's complaint, and you strong foundations of the earth. For the Lord has a complaint against his people, and he will contend with Israel. Again, notice the courtroom motif here. I'm bringing my charges. Go ahead and set up your defense. And you ask, what have I done to you? And how have I wearied you? Testify against me. For I brought you up from the land of Egypt. I redeemed you from the house of bondage. And I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Remember now. And he goes and he recounts their history. And so we have this indictment because after all that God did for them, how do they repay him? With rebellion. And that's his point. Now, Micah, again, responds to that, and of course, this is one of the places. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old, all required by the Mosaic law? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams? That may be an allusion to, you remember, Solomon did that when they dedicated the temple. 10,000 rivers of oil, hey, that'll keep the temple right. Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? And he's shown you what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Hey, we got a chorus about that, don't we? And, but, that was the bottom line. God, in fact, under Hezekiah, of course, they've restored temple worship. But that's not satisfactory if there's not justice in society. See? And it's just like in the New Testament. The bottom line with God is how we treat one another. Jesus said, this is what I want you to do. I want you to love one another the way I love you. And by this the world will know you're my disciples, and you'll experience answered prayer. But in the church, God wants us to love one another, to minister to one another. And if that's not going on, the worship of God is meaningless to him. He wants us, he defines pure religion, in fact, as visiting widows and orphans in their distress and keeping oneself unstained by the world. So he's wanting us to live moral lives during the week and to bring about justice, social justice, helping the poor, helping the helpless, caring about people is what it really boils down to. And then he's willing to receive our worship. Then our worship means something to him. But no matter how emotional we get on Sunday, if we haven't been living for him the other 6 days, it just makes him sick. Because it's hypocritical.
It's being lukewarm.
Hmm?
It's being lukewarm.
Yeah, that's right. And so, God doesn't want sacrifices. He wants obedience. And of course, that's the one thing they don't want to give. And in fact, again, remember what we learned from the other prophets. What's their attitude? The temple, the temple, the temple. We got the temple, we got services, we got God in a box. And he's going, we just pull his chain, we got it covered. And, they're completely unaware. And again, through this prophet, he's making it clear. That doesn't work. Through Ezekiel, he made it clear. The glory of the Lord departed. Two of them all. And beginning in verse 9 of chapter 6, we're told, that God has already begun. Again, he indicts them for their dishonesty. And he points out their sin. And then he promises to punish them. Therefore, I will make you sick by striking you and making you desolate because of your sins, and you will eat but not be satisfied, and hunger will be in your midst. You may carry away, but some shall not, but you will save them. And what you do rescue, I'll give over to the sword. Just, there's nothing. And so, God is going to complete the process of destroying them. He's not going to let them get away with their sin. And so here Micah responds, notice, by saying, "Woe is me, for I'm like those who gather summer fruits, like those who glean vintage grapes." And he's horrified by it. But that's the state of the nation that he's in. And he goes to it and he starts talking about this, and it's not good. It's not a pretty sight. But he ends again with the promise, verse 14. "Shepherd your people with your staff, the flock of your heritage, who dwell solitarily in a woodland in the midst of Carmel. Let them feed in Bashan and Gilead, as in days of old, as in the days when you came out of the land of Egypt. I will show them wonders." Here's a promise from God. "The nations shall see and be ashamed of all their might. They shall put their hand over their mouths. Their ears shall be deaf. They shall lick the dust like a serpent. And they'll crawl from their holes like snakes of the earth. And they'll be afraid of the Lord our God, and shall fear because of you. Who is a God like you, pardoning iniquity and passing over the transgression of the remnant of his heritage?" Notice again, when he looks at the nature of God, this alludes back to Exodus chapter 34, when God declared his glory. When God described his glory, he described himself in two ways. One who pardoned iniquities, but didn't let the guilty go unpunished. And here, he says he does not retain his anger forever, because he delights in mercy. And he'll again have compassion on us, and will subdue our iniquities. Interestingly enough, the same theme is at the central part of the book of Lamentations. This aspect of God's character. And then the promise, "You will cast all our sins into the depths of the sea. You will give truth to Jacob and mercy to Abraham, which you've sworn to our fathers from days of old." Notice the final word in Micah. God is going to keep his covenants. He's going to keep his covenant to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And what is that covenant? What is that covenant? Their descendants will inherit the land.
How do covenant theologians argue this?
Well, the way they do it is they say that when Jesus, one of their arguments is that when Jesus was on the road to Emmaus, and he began, in Luke chapter 24, and he began with Moses and the prophets, showing how he was contained in them, they include the church in that. And so they say that the church is spiritually Israel. And so every reference to Israel in the Old Testament is really a reference to the church, because it's the people of God. And so they would then spiritually apply this to the church, that we are the fulfillment of it as Christ reigns from heaven in the church, because all the promises to Israel were also promises to the church, in that they were promises to the people of God. And there's just one people of God. There's not Israel and and the church. There's not the Jew and the Gentile. It's one people of God, one program of God that began with Adam and goes to the very end. And that there are not these separate covenantal programs or distinctions.
So they have to actually read into the remnant here as the church.
Yes. This becomes the church. And everything. And ultimately, I've seen some of the arguments, ultimately what happened is these promises that were made to Israel and could have been fulfilled literally in a sense. When Israel rejected Christ and crucified him instead of trying to make a Messiah, that act of unbelief, then God set them aside and transferred all their promises to the church. And he continued to work with his people, the people of God, but they ceased to be the people of God. And that's why they also are in replacement theology, that they see no future for Israel. So there can't be a millennial kingdom, and everything that belonged to Israel now is given to the church. And there are some interesting passages that you could use to argue for that. For example, the parable of the vineyard workers where the man builds his vineyard and leases it out, and he sends his servants to collect at the at the end of the season, and they beat some and kill some, and he sends his son, and they say, he said they'll respect my son, and they say, hey, let's kill the heir and we'll inherit it. And they take him outside the vineyard and they kill him. Of course, an allusion to Jesus, the leaders. He says, well, what will the man do? He will come and destroy those people and give the vineyard to a nation deserving it. And he uses a term like that. So you take it to mean Israel was set aside and the Gentile nation received the promise of the kingdom. And so that all the promises made to Israel now transferred to the church, in that it is the, again, the replacement for Israel in God's program. So God's still keeping his promises, but to a larger people group. The problem with that, of course, is, number one, I would argue that Jesus makes it clear, well, actually not Jesus, Paul makes it clear that the church was a mystery. In Colossians, Ephesians, he says it was a mystery that nobody knew until his generation of apostles and prophets. Until then, God did not make known the church. And based on what Paul says, and the biblical concept of a mystery being not something difficult to figure out, but something hidden until it's revealed, that the church is not mentioned anywhere in the Old Testament. Not even alluded to. Or if you want to say the closest is, it says the Gentiles will worship God. But that's really, again, an allusion to not the church, but the millennial kingdom, I think. And so, the church is nowhere in the Old Testament, because we were a mystery. And until Jesus gave the parables of the kingdom, there was no mention of the church, no knowledge of the church. Because the church age is a parenthesis in God's program. It's a pause in his program with Israel, in which he's doing things in the Gentile world that God knew he was going to do. God had already planned it out. Because what did Peter say? That they handed Jesus over to the Romans in accordance with God's foreordained plan. The fact that they were going to betray Jesus to the Romans, Peter said, was predestined by God to happen. It was not a change in plans. And so all these promises made, and I think especially like we talked about in Isaiah, where he says the Messiah is going to suffer. He's going to be killed. He's going to be treated like a prisoner and like a criminal, but be buried amongst the rich. Right after that, he talks about the coming of the kingdom, the restoration of the kingdom under Messiah. So it's in the context of Israel's going to reject Messiah, and he's going to become their sacrificial lamb by their own rejection of him. That's going to be followed by the restoration of the nation. So for him to change his plans because they rejected Jesus is ludicrous, because his plans included the rejection of Jesus. And I think the big mistake in Reformed theology and in replacement theology is they're reading backwards from the New Testament into the Old Testament, for one thing. And their doctrine of sensus plenior, that they think there was a deeper sense behind the literal. Because if you take it literally, you have to have a restored nation. You can't get around it. Anyone in Micah's day hearing this would not have thought church. They would not have thought a worldwide program of people worshiping God. They would have thought, God's going to restore the nation, and my descendants are going to live here, and we're going to rule the world. Now, that's the only way. They would have taken it literally. And so, but Reformed theology and covenant theology, because they have their theological covenants that aren't biblical covenants, and I find it funny, they ignore the biblical covenants and go with their own special covenants. They developed a philosophical theological construct on which to make all this work.
It's hard to believe that God would take Abraham out and say, look up the heavens and count the stars if you can, and I'm going to make many people of you. Well, actually, it won't be of you. They'll be of Gentiles. But it doesn't make any sense.
No.
It sort of seems like the Lord went to a lot of unnecessary trouble if, this nation that he had was
It's going to
Nothing
be
more
done.
than
Why
just
is-
a picture of.
Yeah.
It almost kind of seems, it's kind of funny too, looking back on, the whole captivity and the time frame they were in captivity was them giving the land its rest, that they never did.
Yeah.
They were also called, even early on in the Bible, to reach out to the Gentiles,
Yeah.
to bring them in, and they didn't do that either. It almost seems like the church period time frame is the same concept as the whole giving the land the rest. You didn't do your job here, you didn't do your job there, so we're going to kind of
Take
punish
care of
you
it.
away, and then we're going to give these guys their opportunity to
Yeah.
do what you were supposed to do, and bring that about, and then we'll bring you back into
Yeah.
the picture again so that you can complete your portion.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
'cause the argument is the Jews rejected Christ, so God's through with it.
Yeah.
But, I mean, right here in 18, it says, I'm going to pardon your transgression
Yeah.
for doing that and
Yeah.
bring you back as a remnant.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you could view that God being done with Israel, and yet through almost 2,000 years of constant oppression,
They're still
they're
here.
still around. And at every turn they've been completely wiped out. The
Yeah.
Inquisitions, the
The Holocaust.
Holocaust,
Stalin's
Stalin,
attempt. Yeah.
all those things, and yet they're still here. They even have their own nation now that they
Yeah.
can defend.
Right.
They figured Hitler killed a third of them. And then I think the rest of them was killed, about a half of them were killed, wasn't it? Or more, until 48.
Yeah.
They started drawing them back,
Yeah.
gathering them back.
And ironically,
Tough argument.
Paul teaches that even within Israel there's the remnant. And a lot of people don't realize that the 6 million Jews killed by Hitler, 600,000 of them were Christians. They were Jewish descent, but they had become Christians. About 10% of the Jewish population in Europe was believers. And in fact, worldwide, about 10% of the Jewish population worldwide are Christians even to this day. And when you think Gentiles are only about 3%, 3 to 5%, something like that. That's pretty significant. God is still at work in them. But it is. In fact, as a dispensationalist, see, here's where hermeneutics comes in. If you take a literal, grammatical, historical hermeneutic, where you ask the question, what did the original author intend to tell his audience, and how would they have understood it? You have to have a restored kingdom. Now, Reformed theology and covenant theology, they take a Christocentric hermeneutic. And they say Christ is in everything, and therefore the church is in everything in the Old Testament. So when I read a passage, there is sensus plenior. There is the literal meaning, but then there's the deeper spiritual sense that God intended, and that's where the church is located. So they can read the church in, and they basically, I wouldn't call them allegorize. Sometimes the term is used, they spiritualize it. But now, here's the key to understand them. They still believe it's the Word of God, it's without error, but the question is, how is it being fulfilled? And they believe it's fulfilled in the church. So as a result, you don't need a millennial kingdom because we are the kingdom. But your hermeneutic really determines where you're going to end up. It's really a hermeneutical issue. And if you take the Old Testament literally, you have to have a future kingdom coming because the promises are just simply not fulfilled yet.
Well, and the biggest part of it would be having, a king over everything.
Yeah.
Well, if this is the millennial kingdom we're in, where is that king?
Well, no, they would argue Jesus is reigning in heaven on David's
Right.
throne. But then again, they're saying it no longer needs to be spiritually fulfilled, physically fulfilled, because it is now worldwide rather than localized.
This is true.
And they have good arguments. They have a good answer for everything. You don't have this many theologians who hold that view unless there's some good points to it. But it ultimately is a hermeneutical issue, and ultimately what it is you'll find that they say, the Westminster Confession determines how the Bible should be understood. And so therefore you'll end up there. Let's take a pause, and then we will look at Nahum. Well, now let's talk a little bit about Nahum. It's a short prophecy, not very long. But again, a powerful message. And Nahum's focus is Nineveh. That's why I always remember. Nahum and Nineveh. You know, Obadiah with Edom, Nahum with Nineveh. So, who's the audience? Well, it's certainly not Nineveh, because they ain't going to get the message. You know, I think the audience is Judah. The book of Nahum is written really for Judah's benefit, even though Nineveh, Assyria, is being addressed. And again, the background is, of course, they've had years of Assyrian oppression. Israel had suffered defeats at the hands of Tiglath-Pileser, and he marched into Samaria after long years of Jeroboam II's prosperity and prosperity under Uzziah. And so Tiglath-Pileser shattered what Israel thought was their might. You know, in the vacuum of Assyria's weakness, Israel had expanded and were really overconfident. And so during the time of Jeroboam II, of course, you remember who was the prophet during Jeroboam's time? Jonah.
Oh, yeah.
Jonah. You know, and so, you know, and you've got the book of Jonah happening during this time period when Nineveh is weak, but they repented and they come back up and they become destructive. And of course, there's a series of attacks over the years as Assyria keeps coming back, plundering, destroying. Then you have Shalmaneser's long siege of Samaria. But he dies before he's done with the job. But Sargon II, his son, finishes him off. And Israel as a nation ceases to exist. And again, like I said, by this time, there's only like 10,000, 20,000 people left. Now, they leave some people scattered around, and they bring in others, and they intermix and become the Samaritans. You know, they're the mixed, spiritually and ethnically mixed people who oppose Zerubbabel and Ezra when they come back and want to rebuild the temple. It's these people. Now, at the time of this writing, at the time that Nahum is being written, Assyria is still a power. In fact, they either are at the zenith of their power or have just crested it. At that time, they feel pretty secure. But they're not going to be around much longer because Babylon's coming up from the side. And so they're going to fall. This will come after Ashurbanipal's long reign. You know, the last period of real strength for Assyria had a long reign of Ashurbanipal, but his son and his grandson and all, you know, those who follow couldn't do it. By this time, Nabopolassar, who is Nebuchadnezzar's dad, has begun to make inroads. And Ashurbanipal's descendants just aren't able to hold it together. Babylon gained independence in 616 BC, and they seized Ashur, that city, which had been the capital originally, in 614. So 2 years after they gained their independence, they knock off one of the major cities of the Assyrians. They destroyed Nineveh in 612. So it only took them 4 years to take out both capital cities. So this prophecy is going to be fulfilled in 612. Now, it was a combination of the Babylonians, the Scythians, and the Medes that defeated Assyria at this point. But now, Assyria is still around. They've lost their major cities, but they continue on until when? The Battle of Carchemish. Battle of Carchemish. Around 605 BC. 605, 606.
So Babylons and the Medes were in alliance at that point?
Yes.
Until the Medes took over later?
No. The Medes helped the Babylonians, and then they just sort of go off to be by themselves. And then Babylon rises to its power, and they leave the Medes alone. And then the Medes join up with the Persians to knock off the Babylonians.
Oh, join
So they joined the Babylonians to knock off the Assyrians. They joined the Persians to knock off the Babylonians. And if they could have, they would have joined Alexander the Greek to knock off the Persians. They just like knocking people off.
Yeah.
And remember, the Medes, the Medes are modern day Afghanistan. And one of the things we know about the Afghanis is they love a fight. And if they don't have someone to fight against, they'll fight against each other. So our whole deal with the Taliban is, yeah, they're glad to help us because the Taliban got too strong. They like beating them up. But a point will come where they want us gone because things will be balanced again. And that's the challenge we have over in that part of the world is they're not taking into account history because everyone over there has, still does. But we have this situation. So Nahum is prophesying at a point when Nineveh is strong, but he needs to remind Judah they're not going to be around much longer. Judah feels threatened by them. They're making treaties, of course, with the Babylonians and all this kind of stuff. So, now, the issue in Nahum was Nineveh's atrocities on Israel and Judah. See, it wasn't bad enough that the Assyrians conquered them. It's what they did to the people when they conquered them. And that made God mad. There's the right way to conquer people and the wrong way to conquer people. That's what it really boils down to. Now, we won't get into the just war debate. But, I like the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention has a theme. Kill people nicely. Shoot, blow their guts all over the place, but use steel-jacketed bullets. So you'll just make big holes in them instead of splattering them all over the place. It's like, come on, kill but be nice about it. But the kind of atrocities that the Assyrians did, we've already talked about. They did things like, flayed people and skinned them alive, and impaled whole villages on stakes, and just vicious. It wasn't just a typical chop people down and rape their women and take them off as prisoners. It was behead whole cities and pile their heads in big piles and do all kinds of gross stuff to them. I mean, they were vicious. They still are. That's why the Shiites hate the Sunnis so much. The Sunnis are the Assyrians. That's where Ashur is in the Sunni triangle of Iraq. And you've got generation after generation of what they did to each other. I mean, what did Saddam Hussein, a Sunni, do to the Shiites, the Babylonians? I mean, all those kind of stuff. If you remember when they captured one thing, they found a general and he had pictures. He had picture albums of all the people being tortured to death. I mean, just vile. But that's pretty standard for the Assyrians. So, their atrocities are going to bring God's judgment. Now, the theme here, of course, is God's vengeance on Nineveh. But it's a vengeance theme. It's a vengeance theme. God said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. Well, Nineveh is a good example of how God takes revenge. And the message is, of course, that God's vengeance on Nineveh will be accomplished by him. Why? Because of who he is, because of his character. God is a righteous God. He doesn't put up with this kind of stuff. Even when he's using a nation as an instrument of judgment, he doesn't put up with this kind of injustice. And so judgment is going to come. Now, the way I would outline the book is chapter 1 talks about God's character. So the first major movement focuses on God's character, chapter 1. Then chapter 2, destruction and exile of Nineveh. We get down to the good stuff. And in chapter 3 is a woe against Nineveh, pronouncing their doom. Again, this is said when Nineveh is powerful. What if a prophet was to get up right now and say, woe to the United States? That because of these reasons here, because you have rejected my revelation, because because you now call the wicked righteous and the righteous wicked. Al-Qaeda is going to rise back up, and they are going to destroy you, and you will not survive, and your cities will be nuked. And then soon after that, there goes New York, there goes Los Angeles, there goes Detroit.
Good excuse to go traveling into Europe.
Yeah, that's right. Let's go to Europe. But how would we feel about that?
You have to wait for the part where he talks about restoration.
Yeah. Right. And the problem is, in Nahum, there's no restoration. One difference. When he talks to Israel and Judah, he always ends in restoration. When he talks to Edom and Assyria, no restoration, just woe. So, big difference. Well, chapter 1, he begins by talking about God's character. His wrath is coming. He's a jealous God, and he avenges. And he's going to take vengeance on his adversaries. But his reason for doing it is because he is a God of justice, as well as a God of goodness, but also a God of omnipotence. He's all-powerful. And so, it's based on that this judgment is coming. So these three aspects of God's character are brought out here in the first verses. The Lord has his way in the whirlwind and in the storm and the clouds and the dust of his feet. He rebukes the sea and makes it dry and dries up all the rivers. Bashan and Carmel wither, and the flowers of Lebanon wilts. The mountains quake before him, the hills melt, the earth heaves at his presence, and the world and all who dwell in it. So you see God's all-powerfulness here, in absolute control of nature. And who can endure the fierceness of his anger? His fury is poured out like fire, and the rocks are thrown down by him. Then notice he says, the Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and he knows those who trust in him. And so you see God's character here, and his goodness. And it's because of that he's going to act. But, second half of this chapter, he says, even though I'm good to Judah, I'm going to be bad to Nineveh. But bad in the sense of, I'm going to judge their sin. And so he says, thus says the Lord, though they are safe and likewise many, yet in this manner they will be cut down when he passes through. Though I have afflicted you, I will afflict you no more. For now I'll break off his yoke from you and burst your bonds apart. That's the promise to Judah. And then he says to Assyria, your name shall be perpetuated no longer. Out of the house of your gods I will cut off the carved image and the molded image. I will dig your grave, for you are vile. So, he's going to judge them because of their sin. And the sin of the nation. Now, he hasn't fully defined that sin yet, but he will. But his character is such, his character demands that he judges their sin. And that's the point of this. Now, this is a word of comfort to Judah. Why? Because we're going to see with Habakkuk, he's asking the question, God, how can you use someone more wicked than Judah to judge Judah? And God's going to answer that question with Habakkuk. But here, God does not allow anyone to get away with their sin. And that's the point. And Assyria's sin was really, really bad. And so he's going to judge them. Now, in chapter 2, he talks about their destruction and exile. He who scatters has come up before your face. Man the fort, watch the road, strengthen your flanks, fortify your power mightily. There he's essentially mocking them, telling them, do whatever you can to get ready. For the Lord will restore the excellence of Jacob like the excellence of Israel. For the emptiers have emptied them out and ruined their vine branches. Shields of his mighty men are made red. Valiant men are in scarlet. In another prophet, it was the Assyrians who were doing this to their enemies. And so here in this chapter, he promises not only that they'll be attacked and Judah restored, but Nineveh is going to be plundered and its people exiled. Now, how is this fulfilled? Well, it's an interesting story from ancient historians. When the Babylonians and Scythians and Medes approached, they thought Nineveh was an impregnable fortress. It was a city like Babylon became under Nebuchadnezzar, with humongous walls. And in fact, it had a river. The river flowed around its walls and provided it a moat. And so their basic attitude was, come at us. We'll just close the gates and wait you out. Interestingly enough, one of their own prophets said, the only way we can be defeated is if the river rises up against us and washes out the wall. And guess what happened? There was a flood. It undermined the wall. It fell, and then they were defenseless. And in fact, what happened is when the wall washed away, that part of the wall washed away, the Assyrian army fled in panic and just deserted the city. The Babylonians plundered the city and leveled it. And in fact, it was not even found. They couldn't even find the remains of it until the mid-1800s. It was leveled so bad, it dropped off the maps. It dropped out of history. It was not repopulated. They just wiped it out. They didn't like Nineveh. Everything it symbolized. But it's interesting that God fulfilled this. We can go and see it fulfilled in history. And it took an act of God to bring about their defeat. But as a nation, that was their last real stronghold. I mean, Carchemish was the final battle where they gathered all their last reserves, and the Egyptians came up to help them, and they tried one last time to hold off the Babylonians and just got slaughtered because God was ready to be done with them. But here, Nineveh's destruction did come just as God said it would. Necho. Pharaoh Necho. Yeah, that was Pharaoh Necho. Who killed Josiah on the way up. And see, that's the irony. When he told Josiah, God is sending me up to this battle. Leave me alone. And Josiah, why did Josiah attack Pharaoh Necho? Because he was in his territory? No.
He was allied with Babylon.
Yeah, he's allied with Babylon. He's fulfilling his duties as a Babylonian ally, trying to stop an enemy who's going to go reinforce Babylon's enemies. So he's fulfilling his treaty. And he really should have just let him go, because he was going to get wiped out there. And so that ended Judah's peace. That ended Judah's last time of blessing under a righteous king. Because, of course, his son was wicked. Get carried off by Necho, Pharaoh, as a prisoner down in Egypt. He appoints Jehoiakim in his place, who then gets hauled off by Nebuchadnezzar, who appoints Jehoiachin, who eventually rebels and gets hauled off and replaced with Zedekiah. Just no good leaders left after that. Now, chapter 3 is the woe pronounced against them. Woe to the bloody city. It is full of lies and robbery. Its victim never departs. The noise of a whip and the noise of rattling wheels, of galloping horses, of clattering chariots. Horsemen charged with bright sword and glittering spear. There is a multitude of slain, a great number of bodies, countless corpses. They stumble over the corpses because of the multitude of harlotries of the seductive harlot, the mistress of sorceries, who sells nations through her harlotries and families through her sorceries. This imagery is used to an extent to describe Mystery Babylon in Revelation. Again, you see where the Apostle John pulls a lot of imagery out of the Old Testament. Now, notice it says, I am against you, says the Lord of hosts. I will lift your skirts over your face. I will show the nations your nakedness. This is a phrase used often in the Old Testament. And it's the picture of humiliation. In other words, to do that is to just bring them to absolute humiliation. because it's the idea of a woman having to expose herself. And so, yeah, the promise there is that he's going to bring this woe upon them, this ultimate destruction. And he's going to debase the city. He's going to leave it in ruins. And then again, beginning in verse 8, he says, are you better than No Ammon that was situated by the river? Similar situation. That had the waters around her, whose ramparts was the sea, whose wall was the sea. Ethiopia and Egypt were her strength, and it was boundless. Put and Levim were your helpers. Yet she was carried away. She went into captivity. Her young children also were dashed to pieces at the head of every street. And they cast a lot for our honorable men, and great men were bound in chains. And he says, you also will be drunk. You will be hidden. You also will seek refuge from the enemy. All your strongholds are fig trees with ripened figs. If they're shaken, they fall in the mouth of the eater. Now, he's comparing them with Thebes. That's the name that we know the city by. Thebes in Egypt. The comparison is this: both cities were protected by rivers. Thebes was protected, of course, by the Nile, and Nineveh had the Tigris River. Was its river, and those are both significant rivers. They're not little creek kind of rivers. They're big rivers. Both had allies to help them. The Egyptians had Cush, Put, and Libya. Okay. And so, Babylon had the Medes and all that. Both were destroyed. Now, Thebes was destroyed by Assyria. It was the Assyrians who captured them and destroyed them. Of course, Assyria, Nineveh gets destroyed then by the Babylonians. But very, very parallel to each other. And I think by God's design. You will be destroyed in the same way you destroyed Egypt's most powerful city. Your most powerful city will be destroyed in the same way. So Nahum used one of Assyria's victories to model her defeat in his woe. And I think he's using real irony, because I suspect they were really proud of that one. He says, yeah, you're going to fall the same way. There's nothing you can do about it. This ends with the statement in verses 18 and 19. Your shepherds slumber, O king of Assyria. Your nobles rest in the dust. Your people are scattered on the mountains, and no one gathers them. Your injury has no healing. Your wound is severe, and all who hear news of you will clap their hands over you. For upon whom is not your wickedness passed continually? So his point is this: is that when you do fall, everybody's going to be happy. Why? Because of how you've treated everybody around you. They didn't just brutalize Israel and Judah. They brutalized everybody. And all these nations will be thrilled to see them finally get their just desserts. And so God has spoken against them. And we know from history, he fulfilled it. He fulfilled it. The Assyrians were completely destroyed, plundered, wiped out. And in this case, Nineveh so bad you couldn't even find it for a long time. Worse than what he did to Egypt when he rescued Israel out of Egypt. But again, if you look at the history of God's people and what God does to nations that mistreat them, the Egyptians mistreated them, and he hardened Pharaoh's heart so he could completely destroy Egypt when he rescued Israel. When God was done with Egypt in those 10 plagues, there was nothing left. Every crop had not just been destroyed, been eaten. All their fruit trees were shattered. Their cattle had been killed off. Their firstborn sons had all died, or their firstborn children, of not only the people, but of the livestock. There was nothing left in Egypt by the time Israel left. And it had to take them a long, long time to recover from that. Well, the same thing here now with Assyria. By the time he's done, there is nothing left. I find it interesting. When Hitler and Hitler's Germany went after the Jews, that's the point in time when God began raising up people like Eisenhower and Patton. And he raised up the people. And by the time World War II was over, what was left of Germany? We had firebombed every city. I mean, it was just one giant pile of rubble, much like he did to Assyria. I mean, he's done this more than once in history. When people have abused his people. And that's where one of the promises he makes concerning how Israel's being treated right now by the nations around them. One of the promises is that in the day of the Lord, God is going to judge Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, the Gaza Strip, because that's the Philistines. He's going to judge every one of those nations around them, and he's going to wipe them out. They're going to be devastated. And in those countries, it's not hard to do. All you can do is knock out a few dams and a few power stations, and they're in big trouble because their populations are such now. You could just knock out a few key spots, and they would just simply thirst to death because of a lack of water supply. I mean, it would be crisis within days. And God's going to wipe them out because he is a vengeful God. But he'll do it because of his character, because he's also a just God. And he's made certain promises. And they're hurting his son, Israel. And so just like it did in Egypt, he'll get them too. And Nineveh felt the brunt of God's wrath. And the Assyrians never recovered. Even to this day, they've never recovered.
Wasn't like of the fighting generation or whatever of Germany, it was like 1 out of 15 or 1 out of 20 was left alive.
Yeah.
After World War II.
That's right.
Wiped out an entire generation of men.
Yes. They reached a point where they had almost nobody left. That's why they were using kids. Yeah. Kids and old men was all they had left. Yeah, it was rough. It was devastating. Yeah. And God judged them severely. You have to conclude that. And I think God judged Japan because of their abuses. We don't hear much about it in our history books, but when the Japanese took the Pacific, like when they conquered China, they butchered them by the thousands, if not the millions. We're talking about in one city, they dug this big hole and buried them alive. At thousands.
There's stories when they conquered the Philippines, they would take infants, throw them in the air, and then catch them on their sword.
Yeah.
Firstborn.
Yeah. I mean, it was just brutal. And a part of it was they did, as far as they were concerned, whoever they conquered was less than human. They practiced on their Chinese prisoners. They practiced with their samurai swords, testing them, see how many people they could cut through and this kind of stuff. I mean, just vicious. And I think that is why they ended up being nuked. I think God hardened their hearts where they weren't going to surrender. They were going to fight to the last person. And a part of the nuclear blast was a part of God's judgment. And it's very interesting because one of the things that happened is their emperor was forced by us to declare himself not to be a god. And they were humbled as a people. But by the time it was done, again, they were pretty well wiped out because we firebombed their cities, and their cities were made out of paper. And it was devastating. But I think it was God's judgment for what they did to others. And it's interesting. They've never apologized for what they did to the Chinese.
Nagasaki was one of in the Reformation history class. It was
Mhm.
one of the first entry points for Christianization. If I have that right. Hiroshima or Nagasaki,
Yeah.
one of them.
One of those.
And they tried to get into China from there, but couldn't
Yeah.
for a long time. I don't know if that means
Yeah. Yeah. Ironically, who was it? I think it was the general that led the attack on Pearl Harbor did become a Christian. There were some who God showed mercy to, and through it all were brought to Christ. It's not all pure judgment. Even in God's judgment, there is mercy. But throughout history, we see over and over that God does not let nations get away with this stuff. That He still judges. It's not just in the Bible times. It is even today. And I think that some of what we see happening in the world right now, God is going to judge it. And all in His time. All in His time. Let's take another pause and then we'll look at Habakkuk. And I think there'll be time now to change the